So, Mr. Lomborg, thanks a lot for being here for this interview with us.
Thank you.
Well, you are the most famous climate skeptic, right? Like a person who discussed this topic a lot from many years. What's your take on the environment of the climate debate nowadays? Is this a healthy environment? What would you say about this?
So I don't know if I'm the most famous, but I'm certainly one of the guys who've been, calling out that we have this very odd debate on environment, and especially in climate, where it's either the end of the world or it's not happening at all. Where the reality is, yes, it's happening. It's a problem. It's not the end of the world. And I think my sense is we haven't gotten any better over the last couple of years. So to answer your question, we're still having this discussion of lots of people sort of exaggerating the whole climate conversation. I think they do it with a pure heart. They want you to, they want to take you by your shirt and tell you, you got to take this seriously. But the reality, of course, is you're not getting people to take you seriously if you keep exaggerating. We need to sort of cool our conversation on climate and realize we're not going to fix this in 1 year or even 5 years or 10 years. This is going to be something that we'll have to work on for the rest of the century. And this will have to take a lot of more sensible and cheaper and more effective policies. And that's not popular to say, that's no fun.
Sure. Just to clarify to our audience, what do they exaggerate, for instance?
So they'll tell you, for instance, that climate change makes almost all extreme weather worse, that we're seeing just an enormous amount of extreme weather and we're seeing it more and more. Actually, what the data tells us and what the UN climate panel tells us is we're seeing more heat waves. That's true. We're seeing more strong precipitation. That's true. And that's pretty much it. And remember, we're seeing fewer cold waves, which obviously, or very importantly, are the thing that kills the most people across the world, not surprisingly from a country where I come from, like Denmark, but even in Brazil or in India or in sub-Saharan Africa, more people die from cold than from heat, and many, many more people. And so we only hear a small segment of the truth, and we often hear it exaggerated. Just to give you one good way of showcasing this, if you look at the number of people that die from climate-related disasters, so storms, droughts, floods, and wildfire, we have good data for this for at least 100 years. It used to be in the 1920s, on average per year, about 500,000 people died from these disasters, from these climate-related disasters. Today, that number is, you would imagine, had gone up dramatically. No, it's gone down dramatically. It's now down below 10,000 people per year. So a reduction of 98%, and at the same time, humanity has quadrupled in size. So we have actually seen a per person decline of far beyond 99%. Again, this does not mean that there's no climate problem. It doesn't mean that this is not something we should take seriously, but we need to know that we're much better able to handle it, that we can actually tackle much more of this because we're more resilient, because we're better off, because we've pulled a lot of people out of poverty, and because we have much more information and knowledge about how to tackle these issues. Again, if you scare people witless, and a lot of people are very scared about climate, you will get a panicked and probably a wrong answer. So I try to pull people back and say, yes, climate change is real. No, it's not the end of the world.
And so you say it's not improving, like some researchers like Pielke Jr. or they say, well, the true scientists, they don't go with the alarm. Is that true?
So again, I'm standing a little bit on the outside because we're talking very much right now about the climate science, and I do more climate economics. So I do what is the impact on human beings. I talk to a lot of these climate scientists. My experience is that a lot of climate scientists are really good and very careful, and as you mentioned, they don't go along with this, exaggerated claims. But of course, those are the guys you don't hear about, because if somebody comes out and says the world is ending and somebody says, oh, here's a problem, which one get on the front cover of O Globo,
Yeah.
it's just much easier to sell really bad news. And that's, of course, why that's what we hear.
Uh-huh. A common term we hear is climate emergency. Are we living this kind of emergency?
No. I mean, look, the UN climate panel calls climate change either global warming or climate change. They do not call it a climate emergency, a climate crisis, all these other words and descriptions that you've heard. Those are political issues. And to a very large extent, I understand it, because what a lot of politicians who are campaigning for green policies, they want you to spend 5, 10, 20% of your income on a solution to climate change. Of course, you can't sell that if it's a problem. You have to sort of make it into an emergency, because that's the only way you can get people along with spending that much money. And even then, you're probably going to have a really hard time. And so the reality here is we have a problem, but people are selling a catastrophe. And that's why we end up with really bad policies. Because again, if you have a problem, you're going to fix it with smart and sensible policies. If you have a catastrophe, you can sell anything and you'll throw everything in the kitchen sink at it, but you're not going to do very well.
Your last book is about best policies, yes, to achieve development goals. But let me talk about climate policies.
Yep.
Nowadays, thousands of people die, millions maybe, die about climate because of climate disasters and weather. What's the best way to avoid, or the best policy to avoid? Is reducing fossil fuels, for instance?
Yeah. So climate change is a problem because we mostly burn fossil fuels, which also emits CO2, which lead to a warming of the climate, which then leads to a lot of these challenges that we were talking about. So we'll get more precipitation, we'll get, more strong precipitation, we'll get more heat waves, that kind of thing. So the obvious sense, because we've talked about CO2 causes all this, would be to cut CO2. And yes, that is one part of the solution. Eventually, we'll have to cut CO2. How do you do that? Well, most people will tell you, oh, you changed the whole world, you stop using fossil fuels and you just switch to solar and wind. What you realize is that, of course, what are you going to do when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing? You are lost. So in Brazil, you use a lot of hydro energy, and that's great. You should absolutely do that. But unfortunately, on a global level, we're pretty much maxed out on hydro. There's a few more places we can do, but we can't really get much more from hydro. And so we need to recognize that if we're going to go much further in not using fossil fuels, remember, the world still uses 4/5 of its energy comes from fossil fuels. We like to talk about how we've gone all green, but the reality is we still use more and more fossil fuels. And that's because most people want to get out of poverty. So China has done so with lots and lots of mostly fossil fuels. India wants to do this. Africa wants to do this. And that's where the majority of the human race is. We're not going to be able to tell them to don't do that.
Sure.
So what we need, if we're going to cut carbon emissions, is to make sure that we find technologies that are both incredibly cheap and will cut carbon emissions. Now, the US did that back in the early 2000s. It invented fracking. Now, there's a lot of people who feel very strongly about fracking, but remember, yes, there are some problems with fracking. It's fairly simple to fix most of them with good regulation. If you do that, and the US has eventually done that, you basically have lots of cheap, mostly gas. And the beauty of that is gas emits about half as much CO2 as coal. And so when gas became cheaper than coal in the US because of fracking, you switched out most of the coal with gas. This was not intended to be a climate policy because it was funded by George Bush and a lot of oil magnates, but it ended up making the US cut its emissions more than any other country has done over a 10 to 15 year period. This was simply, you came up with a technology that means you can get cheap, greener energy. That's the first thing we need to do. We need to get China fracking. We need to get India fracking and Africa fracking. That way we can switch them from coal to gas, which is one step of the way. Of course, we also need to get much better technology to get to zero. But that requires, one good example would be fourth generation nuclear. We've
Small
had
reactors,
small reactors. So right now, the reason why nuclear is so expensive is because we build one power plant like it's an opera house, and it's all detailed down to this little place. It ends up costing a fortune, and then nuclear power is very expensive. If we could make these small modular reactors that were approved on the factory floor, then we could basically get a factory approval and then just churn out hundreds of thousands of them, and then they would be incredibly cheap. Now, this is the story. We'll see whether that holds. But what that tells you is we need to spend much more money on research and development into green energy. Because if we can innovate a new green energy source that's cheaper than fossil fuels, everyone will switch. Not just rich, well-meaning Europeans and Americans and Brazilians, but also, and crucially, the Chinese, the Indians, and the Africans. And so that's how we cut carbon emissions. But, and this is sort of going back to your question, how do we fix climate? This is one way, and this is the way that almost everyone talks about climate. Climate problem is caused by CO2, so we must cut CO2, so we must stop fossil fuels. But remember, there's another part of this, which is about our vulnerability to climate change. And so fundamentally, it's really a problem for poor people. Remember, if a hurricane hits rich Florida, sure, a few people die and it destroys their economy for a couple weeks, and then they move on. If the same hurricane, or same type of hurricane, hits Guatemala, it kills tens of thousands of people and destroys their economy for years. The point here is poverty is what makes a lot of this vulnerability. So the reality is, if you want to find a good way out of the climate problem, you should lift people out of poverty. You should get people into wealth. You should get people more technologically able to deal with many of these problems. We should get everyone up on rich world standards eventually. Now, not only is that easier and cheaper and better to do, it would also do much more for climate, and there'd be a lot of other benefits, because remember, for most people, the biggest problem is not climate change. It's the fact that their kids die from easily curable infectious diseases, that there's hunger and there's bad education, a lack of jobs, and all these other things. So again, focus on saying, if you want to fix climate change, eventually we need to get to not emitting CO2. But if you want to solve the problems of climate change, it's very much about getting people out of poverty.
So the best way to avoid climate deaths is by getting rich. Societies getting rich. Yeah.
And this is also why it drives me. I don't know if you remember, there's a hurricane in the Philippines in 2013. It hit a pretty big town right when the COP meeting was going on. I can't remember where that COP was. I mean, there've been so many different places, right? But the point was, it became very big because everybody said, "See, climate change," and killed 5,000, 10,000 people. But the problem was, a similar hurricane, category 5 hurricane had hit the same city back in 1900, when of course it had nothing to do with climate. Back then it had killed half the city's population. And so what really was important to help that city was to lift them out of poverty. Now, they had become richer over the last 113 years, but we could have done so much more. And there's something absurd about saying, you know what, we're going to help those poor people for the next hurricane that they're going to see in 2100 by cutting our carbon emissions. So it'll still be worse, but it'll be slightly less worse, instead of lifting them out of poverty. Stop having people live in that city under corrugated roofs. Make sure they move into stonemason houses. Get rich. Get better off. Not only will it be much better for their kids and much better for their lives, much better on all other accounts, it'll also actually make them safer against climate. So again, there's something really weird when a lot of people, and I see this all the time, a lot of really well-meaning people, they look around, and it's a little bit like looking out in Sao Paulo or in Brazil or throughout the world and saying, there's a lot of problems here. I see joblessness. I see people struggling with disease, not getting enough food, having problem with not good enough education. You know what these people really need? To have a ton of CO₂ cut. No, that's not what they need. They actually need the help with those very specific problems. Not only will it make these people better off, it'll make them less vulnerable to climate in the longer run.
Sure, yeah. Yes, it's interesting how if you get rich, one of the first things you do is to protect yourself from the weather. Right, like you buy an air conditioning or a better house, and it's obvious, right? Getting rich is be protected against the climate.
Yes, but again, it's not just about the climate, right? Because we have made a civilization that people go to New York now for UNGA. For the UN General Assembly, where we're supposed to talk about all the problems in the world. And almost everyone talks about climate as if that's the issue that is most important for most people. Sure, it is an important problem in the world. But for most people, they care much more about lack of education, lack of healthcare, lack of jobs, lots of corruption, lack of nutrition, all these incredibly simple, basic things that we really should get fixed first. So lifting people out of poverty will make them more climate resilient, but it'll also make them resilient against all the other things that they actually want us to focus on much more.
Sure. Lomborg, there has been in recent years backlash against environmentalists. Some days ago I heard a poll saying that Germans fear more climate policies than climate change. What do you think that is the origin of this resentment against green activists?
So I think there's two different things to pull out. In the German case, they're very, very annoyed about the kind of climate campaigners that feel so full of themselves. I mean, look, these are, I think, well-meaning people, but they also feel like they have this God complex. So they'll go out on the Autobahn or the highways and glue themselves to them and block ordinary people from being able to get to their jobs, or much worse, block ambulances being able to save people's lives. And they're just sort of like, yes, but we're campaigning against the biggest threat in the world, so you just got to lie there in the ambulance and die. That doesn't work very well with ordinary people. Yeah. But I think a much bigger backlash is sort of simmering. It's not quite there, not in Germany. In some places it is. And you could argue the election of Donald Trump is part of that. I think we should sort of keep Trump out of it because it gets everybody up on edge, and I think correctly so in so many other ways. But fundamentally, by making this climate change problem the biggest challenge for humanity, and then saying we got to throw everything at it and you just got to live with high costs, high policy costs for a lot of different things. We're going to make it harder for you to get electricity. We're going to make it harder for you to live your life. We're going to make it harder for you to drive your car and eat your meat or whatever it is that you want. And just simply say, we are going to force you to pay almost sort of or what is it called, penance for having caused climate change in the first place. We're going to force you to pay a lot of money. Eventually, people's patience is going to wear out. And they're going to say, no, I'm not going to be able to pay this. I'm not going to be able to force my kids and my family to not have the things I would like in order to make these really ineffective climate policies. That's how this is going to end if we keep pushing it. So Europe has now decided not only that they're going to cut 55% by 2030, but they're going to cut 90% of emissions by 2040. Cutting 55% is going to be really, really costly, and we can see that. Europe has some of the highest energy prices, some of the most migration of heavy industries, so we're deindustrializing Europe. That has a lot of costs. We're essentially, going to end up being a service economy, and you can only cut so many people's hair, and we're going to be poorer for it. But going to 2040, it's going to be impossible. We'll essentially have to shut down or near shut down Europe. Somewhere between 2030 and 2040, you're going to see a rupture. You're going to see people say, hell no, I'm not going to take that. And that is going to be terrible, both for Europe for a lot of other reasons, but it's also going to be terrible for climate policies. Because if you build up this, we're going to be great in Europe and we're going to cut carbon emissions, if that leads to backlash as sort of the election of a Donald Trump kind of politicians across the continent, you will lose everything that you've been doing, everything you've been working for, and we'll be really stuck in a place where we don't even solve climate change. I think that would be a really terrible outcome. We should be smarter, we should be better at this, and we should be much, much more effective.
Sure. I just came back from a trip to the Amazon rainforest, and I got impressed on how many poor indigenous people or poor regular Brazilians hate environmentalists. Like I don't support. I can't stand NGOs. If they came here to my place, I just expel them. And it's quite interesting. It seems to me that you have like a rich problem, and there are poor people who want to get rich, to get rid of their problems, and other people with other kind of problems. Yeah.
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 And it's incredibly paternalistic for these people, rich, well-meaning people, to come in and tell indigenous people, you know what, I know what your problems are, and I'm going to fix them for you with, a climate angle. I remember I saw this IMAX movie. It was actually really beautiful. It was an IMAX movie, but it was very much about how these beautiful reefs and these people living around them, but how industrialization was creeping in and was destroying a lot of things. And this narrator with a very deep American voice, at one point says, "But development is coming." And you were like, yes, this is exactly what they want, right? And we walked out of the movie afterwards. I just could not handle more of it. But it's just incredible that most people don't understand that if you're poor, you want to be not poor. Sure. Not that you want to, I want to cut my carbon emissions. No, I want to make sure my kids don't die. I want to make sure they're well fed. I want to make sure they get an education. I want to have all the stuff that you have. It's very easy for you to, your rich NGO, to come here and tell me what it is I want. But I actually want your life. And then maybe I'll become an activist, but only then.
Sure. Okay, let's suppose Bjorn Lomborg becomes the Secretary General of the United Nations. What would be the environmental issue that you would try to push to the public agenda?
So, first of all, I think it would be a terrible job, and I wouldn't be very good at it. But taking your challenge, I think really, if you look across all the environmental problems there are in the world, and there are many, by far the biggest one, objectively speaking, the one that kills by far the most people, is air pollution. So we should be combating air pollution. Now, again, remember, there are some ways in which you could argue, and we've certainly done that in rich countries. We went through a period where we got richer by polluting more. So if you look at much of the early industrialization in Europe, it meant that cities got all black, and it was dark and at noon, that kind of thing, where there's just soot in the air and all that stuff. And then when you get sufficiently rich, you start cleaning up your act. China has gotten to that point. Some of India has gotten to that point. I'm sure you've gone through the same sort of development in Brazil. So the point here is there are two kinds of air pollution. Rich people only think about outdoor air pollution. But for most people on the planet, indoor air pollution is actually much worse. And most people are like, what is indoor air pollution? But it turns out this is what kills more than 3 million people each year. About 1.5 billion people cook and keep warm with dirty fuels. That's typically that you burn wood, cardboard, dung, whatever you can get your hands on to keep warm and to cook food. This means, on average, 1.5 billion people inhale such a lot of indoor air pollution that it's equivalent to about 10 times the worst outdoor air pollution as we came to know it from Beijing or from New Delhi. This is equivalent for each of these people smoking 2 packs of cigarettes each and every day. And the solution is simple. It is that you get out of poverty, that you stop using wood. There's a reason why we don't use wood in our kitchens anymore. You use electricity, or if you're a little poor, or if you're a really big French chef, you'll use pressurized liquid gas. So there are very simple ways to do this. Lift people out of poverty. So my great thing would be to say, first of all, let's focus on the biggest thing that we know how to solve really well, which is indoor air pollution. That's about getting people out of poverty. Eventually, we also need to fix outdoor air pollution. We've seen that in the rich countries. You do that through a combination of becoming richer, so you actually want to do something about it, and regulation. You do need regulation for some of these things, but that's how you fix the biggest environmental problem in the world.
Bill Gates owns the Terra Power, yes, the Terra Power, his nuclear energy company. In Brazil, he would be a criminal because the constitutions bans private companies in this nuclear market.
Okay.
What's your take on this?
I didn't know, so I don't really have a good take on that.
Okay. Okay, let's go through your most recent book. Yeah, the best things first. In the beginning of the book, you mentioned that one of the problems is how to choose priorities, the most important problems. Could you tell us how to do that?
Yes. So we've talked a lot about climate change, and that obviously is one big problem in the world. There are many big problems in the world. Arguably, the biggest problem is that we all die. But remember, it doesn't make sense to just say, oh, here's a big problem, I want to fix that. You actually have to have good solutions to this. One of the problems with climate change is there are no easy, simple solutions because it's really costly. Remember, nobody makes climate change to annoy Greta Thunberg or anyone else. It's a byproduct of getting lots of cheap available energy. The CO₂ is a byproduct. It's an unfortunate byproduct. We'd like to get rid of it, but it's not something people do intentionally to harm the world.
Sure, it's not caused by bad people. Yeah.
Exactly. And so a lot of big problems in the world, and people love to talk about big problems. Here's a big problem. Let's fix that. No, that's not what you should be thinking. You should think, where are smart solutions? So you need to shift your focus from problems to solutions. That's what my think tank, the Copenhagen Consensus, does. We focus on what are effective solutions. So we use a cost-benefit analysis, which is essentially just what you do. It's a fancy word, or we believe that it's a little better than that, but it's fundamentally just a fancy way of saying how much does it cost to fix something, and how much is the benefit. And then you can say for every reais or for every dollar spent, you'll do this many reais or dollars worth of good. It's a very simple way to make sure that you focus on the places where you can spend a little money to do a lot of good. And so what we've done is we've tried to look at all the things people worry about and then say, are there good solutions in those places? And where are the very best solutions? So my latest book was really just a work together with more than 100 of the world's top economists and several Nobel laureates, where we tried to find out of all the things people have worried about. And that's essentially gathered in something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which is something Brazil and every other country in the world has signed up to, basically saying we want to do all good things in the world. Yeah, so we promised to end poverty and end hunger, which of course is great, but not going to happen. But we've also promised to end war, which I'm sort of, yes, I agree, but I'm not sure how to do it, and end climate change, and and lots of other things, and end unemployment, and get everybody happy, but also get organic apples to people, and get community gardens to handicapped people in urban areas. You're like, oh my God, get a grip. Of all these different things you've just talked about, where do you have the smartest solutions? So that's what we look for. Where can you get really effective solutions? Turns out that if you do this, there's a few, we found 12, I'm not saying that's the amazing number, but it's roughly thereabouts, 12 amazing things that you can do in the world. So 12 very, very simple solutions where for fairly little money, you can do a lot of good. Let me give you one.
Yes.
Or can I give you a couple of examples? Yes. So
maybe on education, or if
Yeah.
you prefer another topic.
yeah. So, well, education is a great example. So, everybody agrees that you should have good education. Funnily enough, especially, rich, well-educated people who like to believe that education is really good. But it is, certainly a basic education. And one of the problems we have is that most schools, so we got most kids into schools today across the world, but most schools, especially in low and lower middle income countries, suck. So they're not very good at teaching kids. And so they come out, they've sort of technically learned to read, but not really. So we estimate in the low and low middle income countries around the world, upwards of 80% of all kids can't really read or write. They can sort of read the individual words, but they can't string them together into a sentence and understand stuff. So one of the great examples of what UNESCO does this for to try to find out how much can you actually read. You ask kids this question, you have to read it. When I say it out loud, it doesn't work, but you have to read this, right? So VJ has a yellow hat, red shirt, and blue shoes. What color is the hat?
Well,
And the answer is red. It's not a difficult question, but the problem is once you get all the way through the sentence, you can't actually remember. Oh, it was red up at the beginning, right? You haven't understood the question. So 80% of all kids can't answer this, and you're sort of like, oh my God, that's where we are. 80% cannot read a simple sentence and understand it. We need to do better. So a lot of people will tell you, well, you need to spend more money on schools. But of course, remember, you can spend money really badly or really well. One bad way to do this is to say we want to build more schools or we want to pay teachers more, which obviously teachers are in favor of, but doesn't actually give you very much in outcome because teachers are still going to be pretty much the same bad or good teachers as they were before you started paying them more. Brazil, I know, actually pays a lot of money in school furniture. You actually put in that you have a federal mandate that you have to spend billions of eyes on school furniture. And remember, that's wonderful to sit by a new chair or have a new desk, but it's not actually, we know this from evidence, it's not going to improve your learning outcome.
No, and as you say in the book, the public spending, the Brazilian public spending on education increased a lot in recent years, but the scores didn't.
No.
So we have this problem.
We keep spending more money, but we're not seeing very much of an improvement. And this is true across the world. However, there is a very simple solution. So we outline a couple of them. We work with some of the best education economists in the world who very clearly say, look, the big problem in education is that kids are on very different levels. So, take a sixth grade, they all 12 years old, say, but they're very different levels. So if you have 30 kids in the classroom, some of these kids are far ahead and some of these kids are really struggling. Given that you only have one teacher, you're going to try to teach somewhere in the middle, but that means all the really smart kids ahead and all the kids who are struggling are both going to be lost. There's nothing better you can do, but how could you get one teacher for each kid? Well, of course you could hire another 29 teachers, but that would be incredibly expensive, unaffordably expensive. But there is a way that you can do this with technology. So we've shown this in lots and lots of randomized controlled trial studies. If you put a kid in front of a tablet with educational software 1 hour a day, that tablet will very quickly pick up on where your exact level is and start teaching you at your level and teach you at your speed. That both makes the education much more fun, and it means they will learn a lot more. So you can actually do this in a classroom setting. So you have all the kids in the same classroom, but now they're learning at their individual level. So they learn each one at their level. That means they'll learn a lot more. So if you do this, if you do it across a year, the cost per kid per year is going to be $31 roughly. They'll be sharing the tablet with many others. We're not giving them the tablet because then they'll just play games with it, right? But the point is, they get this tablet 1 hour a day in front of their face. So they share the tablet. This will cost $31 per kid per year. But the benefit on average will be that after having done this for a year, so you go to school 7 hours a day, is still same old boring school, but 1 hour a day you actually learn something. After 1 year, it turns out you've learned as much as you normally would have done for 3 years. So by spending $31 more, remember we're already spending about $300 on average across low and low middle income countries on school each year. So 10% more. You just tripled the efficiency of school. And we know this from lots and lots of studies that you can achieve this. This is a realistic goal. So for very little money, you can make these kids much, much more productive. How do we measure that? Well, you look at how much better they become at their teaching scores, and that turns into, we know that very reliably, that they become more productive in their adult lives, and that is reflected in higher income. That means over their lifetimes, they'll get about $20,000 more in income. But of course, a lot of that is decades out. So if you discount it back till today, it's worth about $2,000. Yeah. But paying $31 to make these kids $2,000 better off is a really good idea. It delivers $65 back on the dollar, or 65 reais back on every reais. This is one of the best investments you can make in the world, and we know it works.
Sometimes the best policies, the best public policies, are not the most popular ones. As we live in democracies, how can we face this issue, this problem?
So this is an issue I struggle with all the time. So I try to advise people in saying, here's a policy that's really, really efficient. But there are lots of reasons why democracies end up picking bad policies, maybe because it helps a particular group of people. So one of the reasons why we know it doesn't work to pay teachers more is because Indonesia, in the early 2000s, decided they were going to spend a lot more in education. So their intuition was really good. They actually put it in their constitution as well, that they had to spend 20% of the public budget on education. So they ended up hiring 1 million more teachers. They went from 2.7 to 3.8 million teachers, and they doubled the spending on each one of these teachers. So, lots more money. Mm-hmm. And because of the way it was done in different regions at different times. You could do a pseudo-randomized controlled trial. And what it turned out is one of the most quoted education economics papers in the world. It's called Double for Nothing, so you can hear where it's going. It basically showed it had no impact on learning. Now, obviously, the teachers were much happier, so there's that. But presumably, that's not our main outcome of an educational policy. The point should be to teach the kids better, and that did not happen in Indonesia. So it goes back to your question. Yes, you have this situation. This is obviously popular policy because it feels like we're doing something and the teacher is backing it, obviously.
Lots of people. Yeah.
But it's just not working. Now, I think at the end of the day, democracy is just the least bad policy option. There's Churchill's famous quote that it's the worst kind of form of government except all the others. And that's just the way it is. But if you put out the information, here is a really smart solution, here's a dumb solution, you probably make it slightly more likely that people will pick the good one. My goal is not to make the world incredibly efficient. I would love that. But my goal is just to make it slightly less dumb.
Sure. Brasil Paralelo has some values. One of them is freedom, economic freedom and freedom of speech. How can freedom help humans to achieve the more development?
So, I think the freedom is incredibly important, both sort of a moral argument, but also because we know that enables a lot of people to do what they do best. That's what we've seen, market economy across the last couple hundred years. That actually enables a lot more people to be able to get the development and also get it for everyone else. That makes the world such a great place as it is today. I also believe that you need regulation. I mean, we obviously have an issue of, if you have monopoly or near monopoly, you get bad outcomes, and so you need regulation. You need to make sure that people are sort of steered within a good outcome. But fundamentally, the basic point here is to say we need to know what has worked in the past and apply this into the future. And there's so many things we know have not worked. Let's not try and redo them for the 100th time and say, well, maybe the outcome will be different. And I think that's in some way the freedom argument here, is to say, make sure that you have the freedom both to do what you do best, but also to hear the evidence as we know best. So, for instance, when we get back to the climate conversation, there has been to a very large extent this almost policing of what are you allowed to say, which has made a lot of people not be able to say, look, actually more people die from cold than heat. Oh, you can't say that. But it's true. Yes, but it doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't work for, the political goals that we want. Well, surely that, the truth should probably not be in the way of your good policy, and then there's something wrong with your policy. So I think that's how we make sure, at least, we push people to know better and do better.
You also mentioned trade and property rights.
Yes.
It's like a very rare to listen from activists, people who fight poverty, that we need to secure property rights. Can you explain to us why trade and property rights are so important?
Yes. So it's two very different papers. So let me just give you one at a time. And I should also say all of these are backed up by papers that were published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Benefit Cost Analysis. So the trade one is one that unfortunately a lot of the world have forgotten. It basically points out that we all get better off if everyone does what he or she or that nation does best. So free trade. But, and crucially, I think economists also tended to become a little too enthusiastic about free trade as just, free trade will just fix everything. No, there are actually, significant problems, and we saw those in the Rust Belt of the US. If you open up for competition, if you open up for free trade, it also means some people are going to lose their jobs. And that has real negative impact. So our paper was the first paper that tried to estimate what is the benefit for rich countries. And it turns out that, yes, there's still enormous benefits from free trade, but there is a significant cost for the people who no longer can sew t-shirts or can do shipbuilding. Those kinds of things are actually outsourced to poor countries. So what we found was, for every dollar of cost for free trade, there was a benefit of $7. What that tells you is it's a great deal, but you also need to make sure that you actually compensate in one way or another these people who are vulnerable to free trade in rich countries. I think we forgot that, and that's part of the reason of the backlash against free trade. But, and this is the crucial bit, for most people in the poor part of the world, free trade is almost entirely an upside. So we found that for every dollar of cost, there's a benefit of $95. So fundamentally, this is almost all upside, or what you could also say is free trade is possibly one of the best ways to make sure that poor nations can lift their populations out of poverty. So we really owe it to the rest of the world. I love it when people are very concerned about poor people, but I really hate it then when they say, so let's do really ineffective climate policies, instead of focusing on things that would actually help poor nations and poor people, one of them which is free trade. The other one that you talk about, which is property rights, it's a very overlooked fact that most people in the world are not nearly as secure in their property rights as we are in the rich world. So, if you look across the world, about 1 billion people believe that their home or their land is going to be taken away from them in the next 5 years. 1 billion people, it's just unbelievable. And so if you think about it, if you're a farmer, and remember, most people in the world are farmers. If you're a farmer and you have this land, but you're not really sure, you don't have a paper that says this is your land, you don't know if you have that land, what are you going to do? You're not going to improve the land because somebody's going to take, you're not going to put in irrigation. You're not going to plant an orchard where the fruits will only be there 5 or 10 years from now because you probably won't have the land by then. And so by getting property rights, we know that not only will you be much more likely to improve the land, to improve your efficiency of land, get more output from it, but you'll also be able to use it as collateral. This is the Hernando de Soto argument, that you can use it as collateral to make a loan so that you can improve and you can start your journey towards being, digging your way out of poverty. So the reality is, if you get more property right for your land, we know that we can make the land more effective, we can make you more effective, we can help you get out of poverty. There are some costs. So there are obviously costs of getting this set up right, and we also need to do it right. So in Rwanda, for instance, they set up they did everything right and they got all the land rights right, but then the cost of the exchange of my land rights. So when I was going to sell it to you, it was incredibly expensive. So what happened was, everybody decided to go around it, and now we have the same mess again. Nobody quite remembers who has what, and there's no register that actually shows all of it. So you need to get all of this right, but you can do that, and we have good information on how to do that. It costs fairly little. You'll have a lot of court cases, because once we start talking about, is this land yours and mine, we'll be like, but I thought my granddad said this, the land line is here, and that kind of thing. But it's a passing problem, and it's part of the cost. If you do the calculations, we find that for every dollar you spend, you'll do $18 worth of good. It's a great investment, and we should definitely be doing it. So again, the point here is there are some really, really good policies that can help people get out of poverty. There are also some very obvious ones that is much more sort of development focused. We focus on tuberculosis, malaria, and mothers and newborns. So there's something wrong about the fact that people are still dying from tuberculosis. Remember, tuberculosis was the world's biggest disease. It's killed about 1 billion people over the last 200 years. But we fixed it 70, 80 years ago with antibiotics. The only reason why 1.25 million people die each year from tuberculosis, it's still the world's biggest infectious disease killer, is because we just don't care all that much. But for about $5.6 billion, we could save about 1 million lives each and every year. Likewise with maternal newborn health, so we know that about 300,000 moms die each year in childbirth. For most moms in the world, the most dangerous day, the most likely day to die in their entire lives are the day they give birth. There's something wrong about that. And likewise, 2.3 million kids die in their first 28 days on planet Earth. We know how to avoid most of this. It's simply about making sure that you get moms to give birth in facilities, so about a third still don't, and make sure that these facilities have basic emergency obstetric care. This is very, very simple. It's not very costly. It'll cost about a couple $2 billion, and it could save about 166,000 moms from dying each year and about 1.2 million kids from dying each year. So again, the point that we try to
it's like a claim to cost effectiveness. Yes. Yeah. Like, come on, we don't have infinite money. Yes, we have to invest it.
We have to invest it smartly, but also one of the things that really sort of blow my mind is when you add up all those 12 solutions that we come up with, they all have costs. But the total cost is $35 billion a year. Now, I don't have that money. I wish I did, but I don't. And remember, even Bill Gates or Elon Musk don't have that money recurrent year over year. But in the global scheme of things, this is a rounding error. $35 billion is definitely something that we could pull together. If we did this, we would not only save 4.3 million lives each and every year. That's every 7th death in the low and lower middle income countries that we could avoid. Remember, imagine 7 deaths, we could avoid 1 of them across the poor part of the world. That's an amazing thing. But we would also make them so much richer because free trade and property rights and all these other things that they would become $1.1 trillion richer each and every year. And that's why we find that for every dollar spent, you'd end up doing on average $52 worth of good, or for every high spent, you'd do 52 highs of good. This is not rocket science. These are not exciting, amazing, intricate policy. This is stuff we know works, and it's fairly simple to do. I'm simply saying, of all the things you want to do, of all the things you want to be remembered for, don't you want to actually be remembered for having done something that was amazingly good and cheap?
Wonderful, Lomborg. Thanks a lot for your work and for our talk here.
It's great. Thank you.
E obrigado a você que nos assistiu até aqui.